Jesus is the answer for the world today. Above him there's no other, 'cause Jesus is the way.
Today we're going to be talking about the topic of assessment and differential analysis, or a diagnosis and treatment of codependency. But the question really is, last time we talked about a general approach of how to deal with codependency. So why isn't that enough? I'm going to suggest it's because there's so much difference in the different strategies that people use that they need to have different treatment, and we need to figure out a number of different things in order to help them to the maximum possible. I had a client that I was working with, and this guy's a very nice guy. The only problem is he procrastinates, and he always takes on more than he can possibly handle. And he's in a situation where everything is falling apart around him, and he can't seem to do anything about it. As an example, he has a bunch of houses that he bought to fix up as rentals, and he just can't seem to get them fixed up, and he can't seem to approach people to get the rent, and he can't seem to do any of the other kind of things that you would normally do to try to make life work, right? And on top of that, he doesn't seem like he would do anything that I suggested or told him to do. This got very frustrating. Now, what type of codependency do you think we're talking about here? Probably a responsibility avoidant, right? Because they tend to be passive aggressive, and they'll agree to everything, and they just don't do it. But see, we have to dig deeper into that, and we're going to suggest you even have to dig deeper than going into what particular type it is. That's good. But what was it that was making this occur in his life? And we finally got to the bottom of it. Here is the bottom. He had a mom that was very angry and demanding. And so how do you think his dad handled the situation? By being passive aggressive and being irresponsible and by procrastinating. So guess what do you think he learned? But even bigger than that was the fact that this is what he believed inside. If I become responsible like my mom wants me to, I have lost. So therefore the whole thing has to do with he doesn't dare become responsible, because then his mom won. His mom, who was dominant, who was unreasonable, who demanded more than he could possibly do, who was unfair, would win in his life. And so no matter what it costs him, she is not going to win. So do you understand? That means, as an example, the city says if you don't fix up this house by this particular time, we're going to condemn it, you're going to have to tear it down. What do you think is going to happen? You condemn it, tear it down. Why? Because he can't make himself, because inside of himself, he can't let his mom win, and his mom would win if he actually fix the place up like the city told him to, because all authority figures, including the counselor, are people that you don't dare let win in your life, and you don't dare let them make you into a responsible person. So can you see the trap? Now we have to work out of that trap, obviously. See, I suggested to him that maybe he wasn't seeing this right. Maybe his controlling mom wins if he stays irresponsible, because then she is still controlling him. And see, once you get that focus, now we can home in on the real problem that is keeping this thing set the way it is. Do you see what I'm saying? But without first understanding that he is a responsibility avoidant, and then why is a responsibility avoidant, we went no place. He was very nice. I gave him all sorts of ideas that would work very nicely, except he never did any of them. Minor details. So our challenge today is to figure out how can we put all this stuff together. I'm suggesting this is sort of like crime scene investigation. We're going to have to investigate all of the different pieces and pull it together to try and understand what is going on underneath this codependency, what these strategies are, so we can get concrete and deal with them directly. And we have a lot of things that we're going to look at here today. We're going to collect data from different types of inventories and tests, from their attachment style, from power analysis, from need analysis, from connectivity analysis, from historical analysis, from defense analysis, from characteristics and current relationships. Think that's going to be enough? We're going to look at some of that and just get an idea of what it tells us, what we have available in these different areas. And the idea is we dig into it until we understand it enough to put a counseling plan together specifically for this particular type or for this particular person to deal with the real issues that are underneath. There's a lot of data you can collect. Now, obviously, you're not going to have to collect all this data all the time. You're going to collect, sometimes it's going to be very clear and easy. What will be the easy ones? Well, when it's very clear they've been abused, or very clear that they were in a dysfunctional family and they were the first daughter in the dysfunctional family, and so they're a dependent rescuer, right? That may be very easy. Dependent passive or something. They just learned to be a good girl. So let's look at some of that. Now, what's this going to determine for us? The first thing is the length and the depth of treatment. Then the strategy in approaching the treatment. I think by now you already understand that you treat an independent different than a dependent, different than an avoidant. Because the independent is going to do what? You give him a couple answers, he's going to take the answers and run and try and fix it himself, right? The dependent needs support and reassurance. They need to become a whole person. And the avoidant needs to be analyzed and confronted. You got to figure out what is really going on, because that passive aggression, what you see on the surface, is not what you're really dealing with at all. Next question is, what do you treat first? Normally, if they're suicidal, you better treat that first, right? Or domestic violence, or addictions, boundaries. You might have a need for multiple treatment. If these are several different types the person has, or different pieces, you might have to do 2 or 3 different types of treatment to deal with all the issues. What if they changed from one type to another type? How about books, workbooks, support groups? Which ones are you going to use in which situation? And finally, what are the actual issues and the needs that you're treating underneath all of this? So you see, we got quite a pile of different information here in things that we want to understand if we want to do this as effectively as we possibly can do. So here's the list of the things we're going to be looking for. Are they codependent at all? How codependent are they? From a little bit to very heavy. What category? Are they independent, dependent, or avoidant? What specific type are they within that category? Are they a mixture of types? Have they changed types? What are the specific needs, and what is the underlying cause? And then finally, we're going to take our hypothesis, whatever it is, and compare it to the normal list of characteristics for that particular thing to sort of verify that we're not off track here, running in some wrong direction, right? First thing, let's look at inventories or tests, and let's see what's available. I'm just going to give you an idea what I normally use, okay? The first thing I normally do within the counseling session, the intake itself, is I use the Love is a Choice workbook. I use a little sort of checklist they have there. Let's look at that just for a second. I want to show you something about that checklist. The first thing is it doesn't deal with one type of codependency. And therefore, some of the questions relate to one type and don't relate to the other type. So it's not like just if they say yes to all of these, like maybe the book implies. But let's just go through a few of the questions. I'm going to show you some that you're going to see that depending on how they answer, give you a hint one direction or another. How about the one, I can't stand to be alone? If they say they like being alone, what do we know? They're probably an independent, right? Or they could be an avoidant. And if they say they don't want to be alone, we're probably dealing with a dependent, aren't we? Okay? Well, if they say, I'm a perfectionist, what does that tell us? Low self-worth. Because what is perfection? It's a response to low self-worth. How about I am driven by the approval of others? Which type is driven by the approval of others primarily? All to a certain degree, but primarily the dependent again, right? I just flipped down here to a few others. Here's an interesting one, number 7. I put work first above anything. Who's going to answer that one positively? The worldly success or possibly the rescuer. But she's going to be more aimed at relationships, so she might not say that either. How about I can't say no when I'm asked to do a favor or serve in a committee? Who's going to say yes and no to that? Yeah, the rescuer or the passive is going to say, no, I can't say no. Who's going to answer that the opposite? The independent is going to say, sure, I can say no. I'm in charge, right? Okay? And jump down to here, 19. I need to control those close to me. Now, what's going to be the problem here? It's going to be the independent success or worldly failure, but are they going to admit this? Now, if their wife is sitting right there, you're probably going to get a different response. But a lot of times they're going to have so much denial that you're not going to really see this. I need everyone to be happy with me so I can feel good about myself. Again, the independent might not say that, but the rest of them are probably going to say that. Okay? And then I use a little line in the bottom. If you check 2 or more of the preceding statements, you have some codependent issues worth looking at. And most people are going to, right? But I use that just by listening. See, a lot of these things, I'm going to recommend you don't give them this as a test. Okay? You read it to them, and you look at their response, and you ask them more questions as you go along. And that's going to be the case in all of these inventories. You learn a lot more by their responses and how they're responding to, and especially if you've got a couple, of how they respond to each other on these. Okay, you get an idea of what are the independent, the dependent, and so on. And that's usually the one I use right in the intake to get an idea of where they are in the spectrum of codependency. And I have some hints of maybe what direction we're going. Okay? Then the next one that I use, sometimes, but primarily only if I want to know what type, and that is the codependent inventory. Now I want to give you some limitations to the codependent inventory. First thing is it only has 5 questions for each category. Another one is it was based on a codependency class like this one. We actually developed it as part of the class, asking them questions, so it doesn't have a lot of, thousands and thousands of people have taken it, and so on and so forth. However, I think it is pretty direct in what it's looking at, that these are the main characteristics. Another problem you're going to run into, of course, is if there's sort of a blend of 2. It's a little bit hard to sort it out. Another problem it tries to address is the fact that did they change types of codependency? That's why it suggests if you do this, you do it one time as to your overall lifetime and another time on what you currently are. So it's trying to get to the bottom of that one. But it's a real useful thing to use for questions. See, if you're looking at, let's just take a little piece of one and let's sort of look at it and see how it divides things out. Okay, you start out, and these first 10 are trying to look at overall codependent things. And it says, others in my family and relatives have had problems with codependency and abuse. See, if they grew up in a codependent family and other people have it, what's the chances they have it? Most of the time, I take on more tasks than I should. Now that's going to apply to which? Most of them, but it's not going to apply to the avoidant, is it? Some of my close relatives have had problems with alcohol, drugs, sex, or workaholism. I have a very hard time accepting criticism without getting angry and defending myself. Many times I do not let others know how I really feel. So what we're trying to do is those are sort of overall things that cover all the different types of codependency. That's what this is really dealing with. To just try and get an idea of where you're at. Okay? But then let's say you jump down. It says if you circled 3 or more of the questions, you're probably codependent. Then you do the next 15 questions. And the next 15 questions, there are 5 questions for each of the different categories, whether you're independent, dependent, or avoidant. Let's just look at a few of those, and you'll see the differences here. 11, other people are my biggest problem. See, tell me who's going to say these things. Most of the time, I feel driven to get things done. I have a hard time opening up to people and letting them know what I am really like. I am competitive in most of the things I do. People are valuable to me primarily because of what they can do. Now, who is that? That's a clear independent, isn't it? See, if you just look at each of these sections of questions, that you can see it's broken out that way. And to simplify it, we actually didn't even mix the questions up for simplifying the gradient. And so they're all by blocks there. And look at the next one. I tend to feel very guilty when others are not pleased with me. Close relationships are the most important part of my life. When somebody else is hurt, I feel almost as emotionally hurt as they do. I tend to blame myself when things go wrong in my close relationships. I desire a mate that will take care of me and meet all my needs. See, what is that? That's a clear dependent, isn't it? Okay? And so do you see how this is built? This built with just the main characteristics of each one, trying to get people to evaluate that. And then the avoidant. I would rather play it safe even if it means that my needs go unmet. Deep down, I feel extremely inadequate to meet the challenges of my life. Instead of doing it myself, I want others to do it for me. I tend to avoid jobs where I feel I might fail or be rejected. Those are primarily what? Again, an avoidant and probably a responsibility avoidant. And then you go to the next section, and the next section is trying to determine which type of each of those are. Do you see it sort of breaks down like a tree? Now, one of the big catches on this particular test is that the independent worldly success and the dependent rescuer look an awful lot alike. And the main difference between that is the dependent rescuer would like to follow a good leader, where the independent worldly success would rather be the leader. So we don't have too much difference between those. And can you see how things can get sort of mucky when we're only using 5 questions to try to determine? So I'm suggesting it's a good start, but it sure isn't enough. And of course, this is available in my book, Transformation. And you'll find also the different codependent models in there that we'll be talking about later. So you got that. We're going to go deeper now. We're still gathering data. What are going to be some of the core issues if you're going to go deeper? I'm suggesting it's going to be a fear of rejection, a fear of failure, especially when we deal with the avoidance, right? And possibly a fear of shame and a fear of punishment. And these come out of a search for significance. Okay, let's look at just a few of those and see what they look like. But if you've got a person that's really pretty withdrawn, these fear tests can help you see what's going on. If they have a fear of failure, what kind of codependency are we probably talking about? Avoidant or a worldly failure? Let's look at just a few of the questions there. And they score these here on a Likert scale, but let's just look at a few of the questions. Because of fear, I often avoid participating in certain activities. When I sense that I might experience failure in some important area, I become nervous and anxious. I worry. I have unexplained anxiety. I am a perfectionist. I am compelled to justify my mistakes. Do you see, this pretty well pins it down. Even though it's only 10 questions, you can pretty much see how much a person is afraid of failure. And if they are, that's going to have a tendency towards certain types of codependency. And now let's look at rejection. And usually these are the biggest things usually under codependency, or the fear of failure and rejection. But sometimes you just really hit a bullseye with the one on shame, or a bullseye with the one on punishment. Rejection. I avoid certain people. When I sense that someone might reject me, I become nervous and anxious. I'm uncomfortable around those who are different from me. It bothers me when someone is unfriendly to me. How about number 5? I am basically shy and unsocial. I am critical of others. And it goes on, but you see, from those tests, and actually they're fast enough, in about 20 minutes, you can give all 4 fear tests to somebody to see what they fear the most. And that's going to relate directly to the different types of codependency that we're dealing with here. Then we have one more I want to look at here. The question is, how driven is your client? Now, if they're very driven, what's this going to tell us? They're going to either be probably a worldly success or a dependent rescuer, right? Because they're both driven to accomplish a lot. Let's look at that. This comes out of We Are Driven. Just think about this one a little bit yourself in the back of your head. And just use your fingers to count out how many of these that apply to you. Because I know we have a few driven people in this class. I am a competitive person. I am not very flexible. I like to be in control of myself and my environment. I often focus on irrelevant details. I am a perfectionist. Some of my traits are at odds. I tidy in some areas of my life, messy in others. I'm conscientious about some things, neglect others. I give the appearance of confidence, but I feel insecure. I set difficult goals and unrealistic expectations for myself, making myself vulnerable to feelings of guilt and failure. I'm not comfortable bearing my soul. I like to keep my emotions to myself. I don't relax easily. I'm going to stop right there, but how many of those things apply to you? Well, it gives you some good hints of the direction that you might be, and it helps you to say, I might be this one, or I might be this one. If you did well on what I just read, you are not a dependent passive, and you are probably not a responsibility avoidant. Okay? Can you see how we're using these different tests and inventories to sort of eliminate things? And what we expect is what? They're going to get consistent. And the more we narrow this down, they're going to get more and more consistent, aren't they? What's the next thing? We've talked about a number of these things. I'm not going to go into them as much under causes of codependency. The next thing is attachment style. Remember, we used the attachment style to primarily determine whether somebody was an independent, a dependent, or an avoidant, based on whether they were a avoidant attachment style makes you independent, an ambivalent attachment style makes you dependent, and a disorganized attachment style makes you avoidant. Now why? It's because, again, the way you look at life. It's whether I can trust you, whether I can trust me, or whether I can't trust you or me. But automatically, if I can trust me and I can't trust you, I'm going to be a independent. If I can't trust me and I can trust you, I'm going to be dependent on you, right? And if I can't trust you or me, I'm going to drop out and quit. Okay, but this gives you a pretty good idea where to look, again, in our matrix. How about power analysis? Again, we have two different types of people that are independent, two different types that are dependent, two different types are avoidant. How do we tell? Primarily, whether they're proactive or reactive, whether they feel powerful or powerless. Because the powerful people are going to charge out there, that's one strategy. The other ones are going to sort of hide and try and get other people to do stuff. That's another strategy. How about need analysis? Remember, what are our basic needs that underlie everything here? The need for self-worth, significance, love, and security. Usually men are looking for self-worth and significance, women are looking for love and security, but not necessarily. So you need to ask those questions and find out what the emptiness is inside of these people. Connectivity versus flexibility. Just another way to look at it, this is the repair enrich test. They actually do a matrix looking at these different things, but what is it really? If they're too connected, they're probably what? Dependent. If they're too disconnected, they're probably what? Independent. If they're too flexible, what is that? They're probably powerless. They probably feel controlled because they're going to be whatever other people want them to be. And if they're too inflexible, what are they? Controlling. It has to be their way or the highway. Do you see how all of this data, all of a sudden you put it all together, it's going to confirm which part of this matrix, which one of these particular types your client is. How about historical analysis? This is where we find a lot of the issues in the family of origin. If there's alcoholism and drug use, personally or in their parents, what are we probably looking at? A dependent rescuer. Okay, but it also could be an independent or independent worldly failure. The worldly success also could be using drugs, but they'd be much more hidden. Abuse, physical and sexual abuse. What are we probably looking at? The avoidance of the passive. They're the victim. So I'm just saying, all this data says sort of what you're dealing with because a lot of the causes. Low self-worth. That can be all of these, can't it? But low self-worth would primarily fit what? The avoidance and the worldly failure. Abandonment issues. The avoidance again, maybe the passive, probably the worldly failure. Family history of codependence. Depending on what type of codependence it is, they probably developed it from their family. Excessively controlling mom or dad. What are you probably looking at? Well, they either went one direction or another, didn't they? And they're now a controller themselves, so they're going to be a worldly success, or they're going to be a rescuer, or they're going to go the other direction and become passive or avoidant. Physical or mental handicap, mental illness in the family. Probably a rescuer. They probably had to step up and take over. Rigid family system with no love expressed. What's that probably? Emptiness for love. Probably a dependent of some sort, looking for love, trying to get other people to love them. Multiple marriages of parents. What's that going to say to us? Powerlessness, chaos. Again, probably a dependent rescuer. That's going to try to get in control this time. You can look for obvious marriage, other types of things in their parents' marriage in which they grew up. How about fights and separations? Characters of all types of codependency, but generally the worldly failure and the rescuer. Why not the passive? Because they don't fight back. And the success will just run them over. Blame and try to fix each other. Again, probably the more active ones like the rescuer. Domestic violence. Usually the worldly failure is a domestically violent one. Over under responsible. Who's that going to be? A rescuer married to an avoidant. Parent-child relationship. A passive married to a rescuer. Master-slave relationship. Passive married to success. Cinderella complex. What's that going to be? The knight in shining armor rescuing the damsel. So probably a success married to a passive. So just from a lot of this information, when you get a feel for this, you sort of know, okay, that's saying sort of this, and that's saying this. The idea is what? We gather all the information we can and look for a preponderance of evidence, and it ought to all eventually, when you understand this, jibe and come together and say all the same thing. Another thing you can look at is what I call pre-codependence, the family roles. And we talked about that in the class on causes again. A hero is going to become normally what? A success or a rescuer. A scapegoat or black sheep is going to become a failure or an avoidant. A rescue or enabler or clown are going to become a rescue or a success. The good girl, the baby, the mascot, probably the passive. The lost child becomes a passive or an avoidant. So you see how all this stuff, I'm giving you a lot of information here, but can you see all of it says something about what type of codependency this person developed? How they view their experiences. What happened and how did it affect their coping? You're looking for a consistent model, a consistent way that they deal with stuff in life based on what happened to them. Next is what we call defense analysis. What does that mean? It means that people that are afraid or have had bad experiences develop what? Defenses. See, if you have somebody that comes into your office and they have a $300 suit and there isn't one thing out of line and there isn't one spot and they're perfectly manicured and perfectly everything is just perfect, what do you know? Maybe dealing with a perfectionist. Of course, they might have a job where they have to do that, so you've got to ask a few more questions. See, in all these things, these are just clues on our crime scene investigation that you use those clues to dig up more data to see how this fits. After you get good at this, you can actually get to the place. There's been sometimes somebody walked in and I pretty much told them their whole life because it was so consistent. They fit so well that I could just say, okay, and you're like this, right? And you're like this. Yeah, and you're like this. Yeah. Oh. Because that's how consistent this can get. Unfortunately, many times it's not as easy as that. It would be nice if everyone was a round peg for a round hole, but sometimes you ran with some square pegs. And that caused you some problems here. Questions in defense. Do they attack or do they run? People consistently either attack other people, they're like tough girls, or they're good girls. Blame themselves or blame somebody else. How strong is their denial? If everything is blatant and they have total denial, what do you know? Their level of fear of rejection is huge inside of them. They don't want to let you get to know them. How defensive are they to criticism? All codependents are defensive to a certain degree, but the ones that really fear that they're a worthless worm and should be used for bait are going to be a whole lot more defensive than ones that feel pretty good about themselves. How important is their fear of failure or rejection? That's where those different tests come in. Because if it can be huge, especially avoidance, are really huge in this particular area. How in tune are they with their emotions? Most codependents are what? Not in tune with their emotions, but the more that they're in the direction of the rescuer or the success, The less in tune with their emotions they probably are. And of course, the avoidants aren't in tune with their emotions at all because they're passive. They don't really feel their aggressiveness or their anger inside. They've buried it all. How perfectionistic are they? Says how bad is their low self-worth. How prideful and boasting are they? What's that a sign of? Low self-worth again. How important is money and things to them? If that's really important, they're trying to be a success, aren't they? They bought into the whole rat race of life. For me to be something, I have to drive a Mercedes. Are they primary performance self-worth or primary approval self-worth? The performance ones are going to be what? The ones that perform. Now, they may be performing to get approval, and the approval ones are going to be more like the passive. How concerned are they about their reputation? You know, what if they're totally secretive, they don't want anyone to know anything? I actually have clients that are so protective and so defensive that they pay in cash all the time. And they won't put their Social Security number down on the intake form. What does that tell you about their fears about life and how they're looking at life? How controlling, lying, and manipulating are they? The more they're that, the more you know what? They are desperate. They're survivors. They're going to make life happen, and they don't care what it takes. It's all justified. How driven are they, and what are they driven for? What types of addictions do they have? Because that all says how much the stress level is and how much their emotions are messed up and how much of an up and down roller coaster they're on because they have to medicate to survive. So do you see all those pieces? And I know there are a lot of things, and I just want you thinking about those things. And as we get into the individual types, you're going to learn more. Now, once you get that all together, then I suggest you do is you go to a list of characteristics. And in the classes to come, we're going to give you a pretty comprehensive list for each one of the 6 types of all their characteristics and look at those. So I'm not going to do that as much in this particular lecture. But normally at this point, I would be looking at all those and saying, now, I think they're this. And then I would go back to a list of all the characteristics of that particular type. And I'd look at the model for that particular type that we'll be looking at also, the models we have from the Bible, and see how well do they fit. If they don't fit well, I need to go back and keep looking. Or I need to say, now, do they fit this and this? Get sort of the idea? Current relationship analysis. What's going to really confirm this to me the most? I've looked at characteristics now, but I've got them sitting in front of me, and what am I going to expect? If they are really this type of codependency, they're going to act like it. See, if I'm going to expect in this type they're going to be very defensive or very controlling, what's going to happen in my session? They're probably going to run the session. Or they're going to try to run the session to watch I'm not in a power struggle with them. You know, the proof of the pudding is in how they act right now and what I can see right in front of me. And when I ask questions or I try different strategies in my counseling, if they're really codependent that way, I'm going to expect them to act that way. If they don't, I need to dig deeper. So what am I going to do in the way of treatment now? So I've got my information. I've got my hypothesis of what it is. I've sort of checked out my hypothesis, but now I need to put it together in some sort of a treatment plan. We've already given you a number of the pieces. What I will do is I will start out with the general treatment we already talked about last time. Because as I'm doing that general treatment, I'm looking for all of this data and understanding further. And sometimes I already know, as soon as I meet them, I already know what type of codependent they are. But I'm looking deeper and trying to get that. Then I'm going to try to determine, are they independent, dependent, or avoidant? Then I'm going to try and determine which type they are. And then develop an individual plan. See, I'm not going to stop at just, okay, they're a dependent rescuer, so therefore I'm going to look at that particular model of Abigail and I'm going to assume they fit this perfectly. Now I'm going to take that as my starting point, and I'm going to then look deeper for the kind of things that I think might be in their life and come up with an individualized plan for that particular person that I'm dealing with here. And from that, I'm going to determine what books do I want them to read, what workbooks, what support groups do I want them to go to. See, as an example, if I have an independent worldly failure, who's automatically probably going to have anger, significant anger problems, am I going to send him to a codependency support group? Probably not. Okay, he's probably going to freak everybody out in the support group because he normally is the offender, and there are going to be some passives in there and some rescuers. Now, I'm going to try and send him to an anger management domestic violence program to deal with the bigger issues in his life, or at least an anger support group. So you see, I'm picking out based on what I know they're dealing with, and I'm now going to get them the help that they need. Same thing, I'm going to be selecting now, how much are they in the rat race? See, if they're a passive and they're not in the rat race, I'm not going to deal with that. But if they're right in the middle, if they're a worldly success or a failure, they're in the middle of the rat race. One's winning, the other's losing, that's all. So I'm going to have to try and get them out of the rat race. And I'm going to prioritize my treatment. I mean, I'm going to look at this, and obviously suicide, domestic violence, addictions are going to come first. Then probably boundaries to get chaos out of their life, but then I'm going to have to home deeper into what's really going on inside of their life. Here's another one of my rules. Put out the fires in the house before you build the porch. What am I saying? When they come in and we have current stuff going in their life and they're in chaos, I'm going to deal directly with those issues. And when we get things calmed down, then I'm going to focus more into the rest of this stuff. I'll even ask them, what do you think would help you the most right now? But the final line to everything is, what's the Holy Spirit saying to my spirit as to what do I need to deal with? When a person comes in, I never have a totally predisposed plan. I always have the question, let's see what the Holy Spirit is saying, and I'll take it in whatever direction that I think the Holy Spirit is leading me. And of course, the final point is what? Carry out the entire plan and what you're thinking, and listen to what the Holy Spirit is telling you. Because people are very unique, and sometimes all this nice stuff we're teaching you just doesn't come together right like you would like it to come together, and then what do you know? There's something else that you don't know. There could be something totally going on in their life they haven't told you about yet. See, if it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, that means there's some data missing, or there's a piece missing out of your puzzle, or you got a piece put in your puzzle backwards, or something isn't right. See, in crime scene investigation, if it doesn't make sense, what do they keep doing? Looking for more data, looking for a piece of hair, looking for DNA, looking for something else until the whole thing makes sense. And that's what we're trying to do here, because until it really makes sense to me, am I really sure of what I'm doing to treat these people? Remember something else. If it doesn't, that doesn't mean this is a critical problem right now, because as you counsel them, more and more stuff will come out. And that piece you're missing might show up later on in your counseling. So don't go and melt down and feel you're no good if you can't figure everything out in the first session. Realize that this is a challenge, but God has the answers. So as you grow and as you learn, you put the pieces together. See, the client I started this session with and was telling you about, I probably have seen 10 times. And I didn't have that last piece of why I couldn't make any progress. And we finally found that last piece, so hopefully that's going to break the log jam, and we're going to start making progress in his life. But that's why counseling is interesting, because you're dealing with the most complex system on the face of the earth. But the good thing is these systems all tend to work in certain ways. And there are certain things and causes that make certain things happen. And that's what this is all about, is studying and learning about this wonderful creation called humanity that God has made, and then listening to Him so He can help us help them become everything they can be and become as whole as they possibly can be. Let's pray. Lord, we thank You that You have the answers. And yes, we realize how complex You've made people. And Lord, we realize we don't have all the answers, but since You do, we trust and rely on You. And I'm trusting You to give wisdom and help everyone in this class to be able to touch other people and to understand this thing called codependency and help people get breakthroughs in their lives. In Jesus' name, amen.
Jesus is the answer for the world today. Above Him there's no other, 'cause Jesus is the way. Jesus is the answer for the world today. Above Him